This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. Red Hollow, West Virginia, 1980. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, this small coal mining town of barely 800 souls lived by rhythms as old as the hills themselves. Work hard, gather at Murphy's Tavern on Friday nights, and let the music wash away the week's troubles. For generations, local musicians had filled that smoky room with bluegrass, country, and folk songs that told the stories of their lives. But on the night of November 15, 1980, the music stopped forever. What began as a simple disagreement about performance order among 12 local musicians would spiral into something unthinkable, leaving Red Hollow forever changed. This is not a story about violence, but about pride, miscommunication, and how quickly a community's heart can break when understanding gives way to stubbornness. The echoes of that night still haunt the empty spaces where laughter once lived, serving as a reminder that sometimes the smallest sparks can consume everything we hold dear. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Introduction. This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. Red Hollow, West Virginia, 1980. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, this small coal mining town of barely 800 souls lived by rhythms as old as the hills themselves. Work hard, gather at Murphy's Tavern on Friday nights, and let the music wash away the week's troubles. For generations, local musicians had filled that smoky room with bluegrass, country, and folk songs that told the stories of their lives. But on the night of November 15, 1980, the music stopped forever. What began as a simple disagreement about performance order among 12 local musicians would spiral into something unthinkable, leaving Red Hollow forever changed. This is not a story about violence, but about pride, miscommunication, and how quickly a community's heart can break when understanding gives way to stubbornness. The echoes of that night still haunt the empty spaces where laughter once lived, serving as a reminder that sometimes the smallest sparks can consume everything we hold dear. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. The autumn mist clung to Red Hollow like a shroud on that Friday evening, November 15, 1980. Murphy's Tavern glowed warmly against the encroaching darkness, its yellow windows casting familiar rectangles of light onto the gravel parking lot where pickup trucks and beat-up sedans gathered like old friends. Inside, the smell of cigarette smoke mingled with the aroma of fried catfish and cold beer, creating that distinctive atmosphere that had made Murphy's the unofficial heart of the community for over 30 years. Sarah Jenkins wiped down the bar for the third time that evening, her weathered hands moving in practiced circles as she watched the crowd slowly build. At 52, she had seen more Friday nights at Murphy's than she cared to count, but tonight felt different somehow. There was an electricity in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place her finger on. "Evening, Sarah," called out Tom Bradley as he pushed through the heavy wooden door, his guitar case slung over his shoulder like a familiar companion. At 28, Tom was one of the younger musicians in Red Hollow's tight-knit music scene, but his smooth baritone voice and skilled finger-picking had earned him respect among the older players. "Tom, honey," Sarah replied, her Appalachian drawl warm as molasses. "You're early tonight. The others ain't even shown up yet." Tom set his case down carefully beside his usual table near the small stage area that Murphy had cobbled together from plywood and good intentions. "Figured I'd get here first, maybe have a word with Murphy about tonight's lineup. Been meaning to talk to him about getting a regular slot." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, concern flickering across her features. "Oh, honey, you might want to rethink that conversation tonight. Old Pete Hutchins was in here earlier, saying pretty much the same thing. And you know how he gets when he thinks someone's trying to muscle in on his territory. Before Tom could respond, the door swung open again, admitting a gust of cool mountain air along with Marcus Webb, whose fiddle case was tucked protectively under his arm. Marcus had been playing these Friday night sessions since before Tom was born, his weathered face telling stories of decades spent coaxing melodies from horsehair and wood. At 61, he commanded a respect in Red Hollow's musical hierarchy that few dared challenge. "Marcus," Tom nodded respectfully, rising slightly from his chair. "Tom," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of mountain winters and coal dust. He surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone who had claimed his spot at the top of the pecking order through years of dedication and skill. "Heard you've been making noise about wanting more stage time." The directness of the statement caught Tom off guard. In Red Hollow, conversations about music usually meandered like mountain streams, touching on weather and family before eventually arriving at their true purpose. Marcus's blunt approach suggested something had already shifted in the evening's dynamics. "Well, Tom began, but Marcus had already moved toward his own preferred table, the one closest to the stage where he had held court for the better part of 2 decades. The door continued to open and close as more musicians arrived, each carrying their chosen instruments and the accumulated weight of their place in Red Hollow's musical community. Danny Morrison shuffled in with his bass guitar, followed by the Garrett twins, Jimmy and Johnny, whose harmonies had been the soundtrack to countless Friday nights. Each arrival seemed to add another layer of tension to the atmosphere, like storm clouds gathering before a summer thunderstorm. Pete Hutchins arrived precisely at 7:30, as he had every Friday for the past 15 years. At 45, Pete had worked the same shift at the Mountaineer Coal Company for over half his life, and his Friday night performances represented more than just entertainment. They were his chance to transform from Pete the coal miner into Pete the musician, the man who could make a steel guitar sing like a mountain stream. "Evening all," Pete announced to the room in general, his eyes sweeping across the gathered musicians with particular attention to Tom's position near the stage. "Hope everyone's ready for some real music tonight." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a spent cigarette, its implications clear to everyone present. Sarah busied herself with unnecessary glass cleaning, while several of the regular patrons, the non-musicians who came to Murphy's simply to drink beer and listen, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. By 8 o'clock, all 12 members of Red Hollow's informal musical collective had assembled. Marcus Webb on fiddle, Pete Hutchins with his steel guitar, Tom Bradley and his acoustic, the Garrett twins with their mandolins, Danny Morrison on bass, Cecil Crawford with his banjo, young Billy Palmer with his harmonica, Eleanor Briggs at the old upright piano that Murphy had somehow squeezed into the corner, Clarence Buddy Mason with his drums, Robert Bobby Price with his electric guitar, and Patricia Patty Sullivan, whose clear soprano voice had graced more Red Hollow weddings and funerals than anyone could count. Murphy O'Brien emerged from behind the bar, where he had been pretending to organize bottles that were already perfectly organized. At 68, Murphy had owned the Tavern for 43 years, and he understood better than anyone the delicate balance required to keep Red Hollow's musical community functioning. Tonight, however, that balance felt more precarious than usual. "All right, folks," Murphy began, his Irish accent still faintly coloring his words despite 5 decades in West Virginia. "I know you're all eager to get started, but we need to talk about tonight's order. I've been getting requests all week and I want to make sure everyone gets their fair share of time." Marcus immediately stood up, his fiddle case in hand. "Murphy, you know I always open. Been doing it for 20 years and folks expect it. They come here to hear real mountain music, not some modern nonsense." Tom's jaw tightened at the implied criticism. "Now hold on a minute, Marcus. My music's just as authentic as anyone else's, and maybe it's time for some fresh blood to lead off the evening." "Fresh blood?" Pete's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Son, I was playing steel guitar before you knew which end of a pick to hold. If anyone deserves a prime slot tonight, it's someone who's earned it through years of dedication." The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees as the 3 men faced each other across the small space between tables. Other patrons began to take notice, conversations trailing off as attention focused on the brewing confrontation. Eleanor Briggs, who at 73 was the eldest musician in the group, attempted to mediate. "Now, boys, There's no need for harsh words. We've always worked out the schedule peacefully. Why don't we just do what we always do and let Murphy decide? Because Murphy's been playing favorites, Billy Palmer interjected, his young voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. At 19, Billy was the newest addition to the group, and his comment drew sharp looks from several of the older musicians. Favorites? Murphy's face reddened. I've been fair to every one of you, and you know it. But I won't stand here and listen to accusations from someone who's barely been coming here long enough to know where the bathroom is. Patty Sullivan set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. Maybe the problem isn't who goes first, but how much time everyone gets. Some folks have been taking awful long turns lately, not leaving much room for others. The accusation was clear, even without naming names, and Tom felt heat rising in his cheeks. If you've got something to say, Patty, why don't you just say it straight? I'm saying what everyone's thinking, but nobody wants to voice. You've been pushing for longer sets, better time slots, special consideration. And now you want to open the show too? That doesn't seem fair to folks who've been here a lot longer. Bobby Price, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. Maybe we should vote on it. Democratic-like. Let everyone have their say about the order. Vote. Marcus's voice dripped with disdain. This isn't some town council meeting, boy. This is about respect and tradition says the most experienced musician opens the show. Whose tradition? Tom shot back. The tradition you made up to benefit yourself? The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could feel the mood in the room shifting from uncomfortable to dangerous. She had worked in Murphy's long enough to recognize the signs. The way voices got quieter instead of louder when men were truly angry. The way hands unconsciously moved to rest on belt buckles or in pockets. The way eyes stopped meeting and instead focused on distant points. Cecil Crawford strummed a nervous chord on his banjo, then immediately regretted drawing attention to himself. The Garrett twins exchanged worried glances, while Buddy Mason sat behind his drum kit, looking like he wished he was anywhere else. Murphy raised his hands in a gesture meant to restore calm. Listen, everyone. Let's just take a step back here. We're all neighbors, all friends. Surely we can work this out without getting all heated up about it. Friends don't try to steal each other's spots, Pete muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Nobody's stealing anything, Tom replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. I'm just asking for equal consideration, the same chance as everyone else. Equal? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Son, equal would mean you waiting your turn like the rest of us did when we were your age. Equal would mean showing some respect for the people who built this music scene before you were even born. Danny Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his bass guitar leaning against his chair like a silent witness. Maybe we could just flip a coin or draw straws or something. Keep it simple. Simple, Eleanor repeated softly, shaking her head. When did making music together become so complicated? But the question was lost in the rising tide of voices as the argument continued to build, each musician adding their own grievances and frustrations to the growing conflict. Years of small slights, missed opportunities, and unspoken resentments began bubbling to the surface like water from a mountain spring, unstoppable and increasingly turbulent. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the windows of Murphy's Tavern and sending leaves skittering across the gravel parking lot. Inside, the warmth that had always characterized Red Hollow's Friday night gatherings was being replaced by something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The clock on Murphy's wall ticked past 8:30, marking time that should have been filled with music, but instead echoed with the sharp edges of rising voices. What had begun as a disagreement about performance order was rapidly evolving into something far more personal and destructive. The familiar comfort of Murphy's Tavern felt increasingly foreign as old friendships strained under the weight of accumulated grievances. Tom Bradley stood near his guitar case, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of his chair. The young man's face had flushed red with indignation, and his voice carried a tremor that spoke to emotions barely held in check. You know what, Marcus? I'm tired of this good old boys club mentality. Just because you've been here longer doesn't automatically make you better. Maybe it's time for some fresh perspectives, instead of the same old songs played the same old way. Marcus Webb's weathered face hardened like granite, his fiddle bow held in his right hand like a weapon he might use to punctuate his words. Fresh perspectives. Boy, you don't even understand what you're trying to replace. These songs, this music, it's the soul of Red Hollow. It's stories of people who worked themselves to death in those mines, who lost sons in wars, who built this community with their bare hands. You can't just waltz in here with your fancy finger-picking and think you understand what any of that means. The accusation struck deep, and Tom's response came hot and fast. Don't you dare question my understanding of this place. My grandfather died in the Mountaineer mine collapse of '63. My father's been working those same tunnels for 20 years. I've got just as much right to tell these stories as you do, and maybe I can tell them in a way that actually reaches people, instead of just preaching to the same tired choir. A collective intake of breath swept through Murphy's as the sacred memory of the mine collapse was invoked. 12 men had died that day, including Tom's grandfather, and the tragedy remained a defining moment in Red Hollow's collective memory. To use it as ammunition in a musical dispute felt like crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. Pete Hutchins set his beer down with deliberate force, foam splashing onto the scarred wooden table. That's enough. You don't get to use tragedy to justify your ambition, son. Those men deserve better than being turned into props for your argument. Props? Tom whirled to face Pete, his guitar forgotten as anger took complete control. You think that's what this is about? You think I'm using my grandfather's death to get stage time? That's the most disgusting thing anyone's ever said to me in this place. Patty Sullivan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Well, maybe if you'd shown some respect for the people who came before you, instead of acting like you invented music in Red Hollow, folks wouldn't question your motives. The attack from Patty surprised everyone, including Tom. She had always been one of the more diplomatic members of the group, quick to smooth over conflicts and find common ground. Her willingness to join the verbal assault signaled that the evening's hostilities had reached a new level. Respect? Tom's laugh was bitter and harsh. You want to talk about respect? How about respecting the fact that music is supposed to evolve, supposed to grow? How about respecting the idea that maybe, just maybe, there's room for more than one approach to playing these songs? Eleanor Briggs stood up slowly, her 73-year-old frame trembling slightly with emotion. Stop it. All of you, just stop it right now. This is not who we are. This is not what music is supposed to do to people. But her plea for sanity was immediately challenged by Bobby Price, whose electric guitar had been the source of controversy for years among the more traditional players. Easy for you to say, Eleanor. You've had your spot at that piano for decades. Nobody ever questioned your right to be there. Some of us are tired of fighting for scraps while the same people hog all the best time slots. The accusation stung Eleanor deeply. She had indeed held a privileged position in Red Hollow's musical hierarchy, partly due to her age, and partly because the old upright piano was permanently installed in Murphy's corner. Her ownership of that instrument had given her a stability that the other musicians lacked, and Bobby's words forced everyone to confront the inherent inequalities in their informal system. Cecil Crawford, normally one of the quieter members of the group, suddenly found his voice. Bobby's right. We've all been tiptoeing around the truth for years. There's an inner circle and an outer circle, and if you're not in the inner circle, you get whatever time is left over after the favorites have had their fill. Danny Morrison nodded vigorously in agreement. Exactly. And heaven forbid you try to play something that doesn't fit their narrow definition of authentic mountain music. God knows I've been told often enough that bass guitar isn't traditional, like tradition is some kind of sacred law that can never be changed. Marcus Webb's face had gone pale with anger, his knuckles standing out white against the dark wood of his fiddle neck. Sacred law? You're damn right it is. This music isn't some hobby for you people to experiment with. It's the voice of our people, the story of our struggles. And you want to water it down, commercialize it, turn it into something that'll play well for tourists and outsiders. Our people, Billy Palmer's young voice cracked with indignation. Who made you the spokesperson for everyone in Red Hollow? Who gave you the right to decide what counts as authentic and what doesn't? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the older musicians believed about their role in preserving Red Hollow's cultural heritage. Marcus turned to face the 19-year-old harmonica player, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Boy, I've been playing this music since before you were born. I learned these songs from men who learned them from their fathers, who learned them from their fathers before them. That chain of tradition means something. It connects us to who we are, where we came from. And you want to break that chain because you think you know better?" Billy's response was immediate and devastating. Maybe that chain needs to be broken. Maybe holding on to the past so tight is what's killing this place. Look around, Marcus. Half the young people in Red Hollow leave as soon as they graduate high school because there's nothing here for them. Nothing but old men telling them how things used to be and how they should be grateful for scraps. The words struck like physical blows, not just at Marcus, but at everyone over 30 in the room. The exodus of young people from Appalachian communities was a painful reality that most preferred not to discuss directly. Billy's willingness to throw it in their faces felt like a betrayal of unspoken agreements about what topics were too sensitive to weaponize. Clarence "Buddy" Mason, who had been sitting silently behind his drum kit, finally spoke up. "Billy's not wrong, though. We act like this music scene is some kind of sacred trust, but what are we really preserving? The right for the same 5 people to dominate every Friday night? The right to keep playing the same songs the same way until everyone stops listening?" The Garrett twins, Jimmy and Johnny, exchanged meaningful looks before Jimmy cleared his throat. "We've been talking about this for months, actually, thinking maybe it's time to find somewhere else to play, somewhere that welcomes new ideas instead of fighting them." The threat to leave hit Murphy O'Brien like a physical blow. The Garrett twins' harmonies were one of the main attractions that brought people to his tavern on Friday nights. Losing them would mean losing customers, and losing customers could mean losing his business. "Now hold on just a minute," Murphy interjected, his Irish accent becoming more pronounced under stress. "Nobody's leaving anywhere. We're all adults here, and adults can work out their differences without throwing tantrums and making threats." "Tantrums?" Tom's voice rose dangerously. "Is that what you think this is? We're talking about basic fairness, basic respect, and you call it a tantrum?" Pete Hutchins slammed his hand down on the table, making everyone jump. "Respect? You want to know about respect? Respect is understanding that some things are bigger than your personal ambitions. Respect is recognizing that experience matters, that tradition matters, that not everything needs to change just because you're impatient. And respect," Tom shot back, "is admitting when a system isn't working instead of defending it just because it benefits you personally." The accusation of self-interest clearly stung Pete, whose steel guitar skills had indeed earned him a prominent place in Red Hollow's musical hierarchy. His response came loaded with personal venom. "At least my place was earned through years of dedication, not by showing up and demanding special treatment, because I think I'm more talented than everyone else." "Special treatment?" Tom's voice cracked with incredulous anger. "I'm asking for the same opportunity as everyone else. How is that special treatment?" Patty Sullivan laughed, but the sound was cold and cutting. "Because you're not asking for the same opportunity, Tom. You're asking to jump the line, to skip past people who've been waiting their turn for years. You want Marcus's opening slot, Pete's prime time, Eleanor's piano privileges. You want it all, and you want it now." The accuracy of Patty's assessment clearly hit home, because Tom's response lacked his previous conviction. That's not what I'm asking for." "Isn't it?" Bobby Price joined the attack. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been positioning yourself for a takeover ever since you started coming here. Longer sets, better time slots, special requests from Murphy, and now you want the opening slot too. What's next? Your own night?" The suggestion that Tom harbored ambitions beyond Friday night performances introduced a new level of paranoia into the conflict. If Tom was indeed planning some kind of musical coup, it would explain his recent assertiveness and justify the defensive reactions from the established players. Eleanor Briggs shook her head sadly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is breaking my heart. 40 years I've been coming to Murphy's, 40 years of making music with friends and neighbors, and now look at us. Look what we've become." Her words might have served as a wake-up call, a moment for everyone to step back and remember what they were really fighting about. Instead, they seemed to fuel the fire, as each musician began voicing their own accumulated frustrations and disappointments. Cecil Crawford's banjo had been sitting silent beside his chair, but now he picked it up and clutched it protectively. "You know what's breaking my heart, Eleanor? It's watching this place turn into some kind of popularity contest where the loudest voice wins instead of the best music. It's watching real musicians get pushed aside by people who think volume and attitude matter more than skill and respect." Danny Morrison stood up abruptly, his bass guitar in his hands. "You want to talk about skill? Let's talk about skill. How about the skill it takes to learn new songs instead of playing the same 12 pieces every Friday for 20 years? How about the skill it takes to adapt your music to what people actually want to hear instead of forcing them to sit through your personal nostalgia trip?" The room erupted into a cacophony of angry voices as long-suppressed resentments poured forth like water through a broken dam. Marcus and Pete began a heated exchange about the relative merits of traditional versus contemporary approaches to mountain music. The Garrett twins argued with Bobby Price about the role of electric instruments in acoustic settings. Billy Palmer and Cecil Crawford debated the value of innovation versus preservation, their voices rising to be heard over the growing din. Sarah Jenkins watched from behind the bar with mounting alarm as the situation spiraled completely out of control. She had seen disagreements before, heated discussions about music and politics and everything else that mattered to people in small towns. But this felt different. This felt dangerous in a way that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Murphy O'Brien moved from table to table, trying desperately to restore some semblance of order to his establishment. But his attempts at mediation were largely ignored, as each musician became increasingly focused on airing their personal grievances and defending their own positions. The regular patrons, the people who came to Murphy's simply to drink beer and listen to music, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some started gathering their coats, clearly unwilling to remain in a room that had become charged with such hostility. Others watched with morbid fascination as their local musicians tore each other apart with words that could never be taken back. As the clock approached 9 o'clock, the hour when music usually began at Murphy's Tavern, the only sounds filling the smoky air were voices raised in anger, accusations flying like bullets, and the gradual dissolution of a community that had taken generations to build. The instruments sat silent and forgotten, while their owners engaged in a war of words that would echo through Red Hollow long after the last angry phrase had been spoken. Outside, the November wind continued to howl through the mountains, as if nature itself was providing a soundtrack to the destruction taking place within the warm yellow light of Murphy's windows. The clock struck 9, and for the first time in over 2 decades, no music began at Murphy's Tavern. Instead, the air crackled with an electricity that had nothing to do with Bobby Price's amplified guitar, and everything to do with the toxic atmosphere that had consumed Red Hollow's musical community. What had started as a simple disagreement about performance order had metastasized into something far more destructive, a complete breakdown of the social fabric that had held these musicians together for years. Tom Bradley stood in the center of the room now, his guitar case forgotten, as he faced off against what felt like the entire established order of Red Hollow's music scene. His face was flushed with a combination of anger and adrenaline, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he had moved beyond caring about consequences. "You know what? I'm done pretending this is about tradition or respect or any of that noble garbage you keep spouting. This is about power, pure and simple. You old-timers have had control for so long that you can't imagine sharing it with anyone else." Marcus Webb's weathered hands shook slightly as he gripped his fiddle bow, his knuckles white with tension. At 61, he had weathered countless storms in his life, economic downturns that closed minds, family tragedies that tested his faith, community conflicts that threatened to tear Red Hollow apart. But nothing had prepared him for this frontal assault on everything he held sacred about the musical traditions he had spent his entire adult life preserving. Power. You think this is about power? Boy, I've never asked for anything from this community, except the chance to keep our heritage alive. Every Friday night for 20 years, I've stood on that little stage and played the songs that tell the story of who we are, where we came from. And you call that a power grab? "I call it exactly what it is," Tom shot back, his voice rising to fill the entire tavern. "A monopoly. You and Pete and Eleanor, you've carved up this place between yourselves like it's your personal kingdom. And anyone who dares to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there might be room for other voices gets treated like an interloper who doesn't understand the sacred mysteries of mountain music." Pete Hutchins set down his steel guitar with deliberate care, as if the instrument might break under the weight of his mounting fury. His 45 years of life had been hard ones, decades in the coal mines, a divorce that had taken half of everything he owned, the constant struggle to make ends meet on wages that never seemed to stretch far enough. His Friday night performances at Murphy's represented the one space in his life where he felt truly valued, truly appreciated for something other than his ability to extract coal from the earth. Tom's attack felt like an assault on his very identity. Monopoly? Monopoly. I earned my place on that stage through 23 years of dedication, through learning every traditional song I could get my hands on, through showing up every single Friday whether I felt like it or not. You've been coming here for what, 2 years? And you think that entitles you to the same consideration as people who've been building this scene since before you knew what a guitar was. The accusation stung Tom deeply, partly because it contained a grain of truth that he was reluctant to acknowledge. He had indeed been a relative newcomer to Red Hollow's music scene, and his rapid rise in prominence had been facilitated partly by his natural talent and partly by his relentless ambition. But from his perspective, the length of time someone had been playing at Murphy's mattered less than the quality of their contributions and their ability to connect with audiences. Building this scene? You call playing the same tired songs week after week building? You call driving away half the potential audience because they're bored with your nostalgic retreads building? I've seen the attendance numbers, Pete. I've watched people stop coming because they know exactly what they're going to hear and they're tired of it. The reference to declining attendance hit Murphy O'Brien like a physical blow. As the owner of the tavern, he was acutely aware of the gradual drop in Friday night crowds, and he had been struggling to find ways to revitalize the music program without alienating his established performers. Tom's public acknowledgement of this sensitive issue felt like a betrayal of confidence, an exposure of vulnerabilities that Murphy preferred to keep private. "Now you just hold on there, son. The attendance at my establishment is my business, not yours. And if you're suggesting that these fine musicians are somehow responsible for any changes in crowd size, well, that's just plain insulting to people who've been nothing but loyal to this place." But Tom was beyond caring about Murphy's sensitivities or anyone else's feelings. The months of frustration, of being treated like a second-class citizen in the musical community he desperately wanted to join, had finally boiled over into open rebellion. Loyal? Is that what you call it when someone refuses to adapt, refuses to grow, refuses to make room for new ideas? Because from where I stand, that looks more like selfishness than loyalty. Eleanor Briggs, who had been trying to stay above the fray, finally reached her breaking point. At 73, she had lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the coal mine disasters that had claimed so many Red Hollow men, and countless personal tragedies that had tested her faith in human nature. But she had never witnessed such a deliberate destruction of community bonds, such a callous disregard for the feelings and contributions of others. Her voice shook with emotion as she rose from her position at the piano bench. "Selfish? You want to talk about selfish? Selfish is a young man who thinks his personal ambitions matter more than the relationships that have held this community together for decades. Selfish is someone who would rather tear down what others have built than put in the time and effort to earn his place honestly." The attack from Eleanor, universally respected as the grandmother figure of Red Hollow's music scene, clearly rattled Tom more than the criticisms from Marcus or Pete. But instead of backing down or apologizing, he doubled down on his aggression, his voice taking on a cruel edge that shocked everyone in the room. "Earn my place honestly. What does that even mean, Eleanor? Does it mean waiting 20 years for you to die so someone else can play the piano? Does it mean pretending that your arthritic fingers can still handle complex pieces when everyone knows you're just going through the motions?" The gasp that swept through Murphy's Tavern was audible, a collective intake of breath as the assembled crowd processed what Tom had just said. To attack Eleanor's age and physical limitations crossed a line that no one had ever dared cross before. It was one thing to argue about musical styles or performance schedules. It was something entirely different to mock a respected elder's physical decline. Bobby Price, who had been generally sympathetic to Tom's position, stared at him in shocked disbelief. "Jesus Christ, Tom, that's Eleanor you're talking to. Show some respect." But the damage was already done, and Tom seemed to realize that he had crossed a point of no return. Instead of apologizing or trying to walk back his comments, he pressed forward with the kind of reckless abandon that comes when someone has already burned their bridges and decided they might as well burn everything else too. Respect? You all keep talking about respect, but what you really mean is deference. You want everyone to bow down to the established order, to accept their assigned place in the hierarchy, to never question why things are the way they are. Patty Sullivan's voice cut through the room like a whip crack, her usual diplomatic demeanor completely abandoned. "You know what, Tom? You're absolutely right about one thing. We do expect deference. We expect newcomers to show some humility, to acknowledge that they might have something to learn from people who've been doing this longer. We expect them to earn their stripes instead of demanding instant gratification. And if you think that's unreasonable, then maybe you don't belong here at all." The suggestion that Tom didn't belong in Red Hollow's music scene was the ultimate insult, the nuclear option that no one had dared deploy until now. It struck at the heart of his identity as a musician and his sense of connection to the community where he had been born and raised. His response was immediate and devastating. "Don't belong here. This is my hometown, Patty. I was born in Red Hollow, grew up in Red Hollow, and I've got just as much right to be here as anyone else. And if you think your seniority gives you the authority to decide who belongs and who doesn't, then you're even more deluded than I thought." The personal attacks were now flying freely, each musician abandoning any pretense of discussing musical issues in favor of airing every grievance, resentment, and frustration they had accumulated over years of collaboration. Cecil Crawford, normally one of the most mild-mannered members of the group, found himself drawn into the conflict, despite his natural inclination toward peacemaking. "You talk about belonging, Tom. But belonging means more than just being born somewhere. It means understanding the culture, respecting the traditions, caring about something bigger than your own ego." "My ego?" Tom's laugh was harsh and bitter. That's rich coming from someone who spent the last 5 years complaining that his banjo doesn't get featured prominently enough in the group arrangements. "At least I'm honest about wanting recognition for my contributions instead of passive-aggressively undermining other people's performances." The accusation that Cecil had been sabotaging other musicians' performances was news to everyone in the room, including Cecil himself. But Tom's willingness to make such specific charges suggested that he had been cataloguing perceived slights and storing them up for exactly this kind of confrontation. The revelation that he had been keeping score, mentally noting every instance where he felt disrespected or undervalued, cast his entire participation in the music scene in a different light. Danny Morrison, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the evening, finally exploded. "You want to know about passive-aggressive undermining? How about the way you've been positioning yourself as the voice of the younger generation, like everyone under 30 automatically agrees with your assessment of how things should be run? How about the way you've been cultivating relationships with Murphy behind everyone's back, angling for special considerations that the rest of us never get?" The accusation that Tom had been conducting secret negotiations with Murphy O'Brien sent shockwaves through the group. If true, it would represent exactly the kind of political maneuvering that could destroy the informal democratic spirit that had always characterized Red Hollow's music scene. All eyes turned to Murphy, whose face had gone pale as he realized he was about to be dragged into the center of a conflict he had been desperately trying to avoid. "Now, that's not... I mean, Tom and I have talked, sure, but it wasn't..." Murphy's stammering response only confirmed everyone's worst suspicions about backroom deals and special arrangements. The tavern owner's inability to deny the charges convincingly added a new layer of betrayal to the evening's accumulating grievances. Billy Palmer, whose youthful idealism had been gradually eroded by the venomous exchanges he was witnessing, shook his head in disgust. "This is unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. I came here tonight thinking we were going to argue about who plays first, and instead I'm watching people I respected tear each other apart like animals. Is this really what being an adult means? Is this what I have to look forward to? The 19-year-old's question hung in the air like an indictment of everything the older musicians had become. His disappointment was palpable, his disillusionment with the community he had hoped to join evident in every word. But instead of serving as a wake-up call, Billy's comments only seemed to fuel the fire, as each faction began competing to win his allegiance. "Billy, don't let these people poison your mind against tradition," Marcus urged, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "What you're seeing tonight isn't normal. These are good people who've lost their way, but the music itself is still pure, still worth preserving." "Pure?" Tom scoffed. "Is that what you call this territorial pissing contest? Pure? Billy, don't listen to these people who want to trap you in the past. Music is supposed to evolve, supposed to grow. Don't let them convince you that creativity and innovation are somehow disrespectful to your heritage." The competition for Billy's support highlighted just how much was at stake in the evening's conflict. It wasn't just about performance schedules or musical styles. It was about the future direction of Red Hollow's cultural identity, about whether the community would embrace change or cling to tradition, about whether the next generation would find reasons to stay or continue the exodus to larger cities where opportunities seemed more abundant. The Garrett twins, Jimmy and Johnny, had been whispering between themselves throughout the escalating conflict, and now they stood up simultaneously, their mandolins cradled protectively in their arms. Jimmy, who usually served as the spokesman for the pair, cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "We've been talking and we think maybe it's time for us to step back from all this. Find somewhere else to play where people actually want to make music together, instead of using music as an excuse to settle personal scores." The threat of the Garrett twins' departure sent a shockwave through the room that was felt most acutely by Murphy O'Brien, whose Friday night revenues depended heavily on the crowds that came specifically to hear the brothers' distinctive harmonies. But it also represented something larger, the possibility that Red Hollow's music scene might not survive the evening intact, that the community gathering that had brought people together for over 2 decades might finally collapse under the weight of accumulated resentments and incompatible visions. "Now hold on," Murphy pleaded, his Irish accent thickening under stress. "Nobody needs to be leaving anywhere. We're all adults here, and adults can work through their differences if they just put their minds to it. There's room for everyone at Murphy's, room for tradition and innovation, room for experienced players and newcomers alike." But Murphy's desperate attempt at reconciliation was immediately challenged by Pete Hutchins, whose anger had been building to a crescendo throughout the evening. "Room for everyone? Is that what you call it when you give Tom special privileges that the rest of us never got? When you let him play longer sets, schedule him for prime time slots, negotiate private arrangements that bypass the informal agreements the rest of us have honored for years?" The confirmation that Tom had indeed received preferential treatment from Murphy sent ripples of betrayal through the assembled musicians. Even those who had been sympathetic to Tom's desire for more prominent placement felt deceived by the revelation that he had been working behind the scenes to gain advantages that weren't available to others. Eleanor Briggs, still reeling from Tom's earlier attack on her physical capabilities, found her voice again with a strength that surprised everyone present. "I've been playing at Murphy's since 1963, 17 years old and scared to death to perform in public. Murphy's father gave me my first chance, told me that music was about bringing people together, not tearing them apart. And now look at us. Look what we've become in the name of artistic ambition and personal recognition." Her invocation of Murphy's father, who had run the Tavern before his son took over, carried special weight in Red Hollow's collective memory. The elder O'Brien had been universally respected as a man who understood the delicate balance required to maintain community harmony while fostering individual expression. His memory served as a reminder of better times, when the music scene had been characterized by mutual support rather than cutthroat competition, but even Eleanor's emotional appeal couldn't penetrate the wall of anger and resentment that had built up throughout the evening. Bobby Price, whose electric guitar had always made him something of an outsider in the predominantly acoustic group, seized the opportunity to voice his own long-suppressed frustrations. Easy words from someone who's never had to fight for acceptance, Eleanor, you've been the queen of this scene since before most of us were born. You've never had to prove yourself, never had to justify your place, never had to listen to whispers about whether your instrument belongs in a traditional setting. The attack on Eleanor's privileged position within the group's hierarchy was particularly painful because it contained elements of truth that she had never fully acknowledged. Her status as the piano player had indeed insulated her from many of the competitive pressures that affected the other musicians, and her long tenure had given her an authority that was rarely questioned or challenged. Clarence Buddy Mason, who had been quietly observing the escalating conflict from behind his drum kit, finally decided to add his voice to the chaos. You know what the real problem is here? It's that we've all been pretending this is some kind of democratic collective when it's really been an oligarchy from day one. Marcus, Pete, and Eleanor have been running this show for 20 years, and the rest of us have been grateful for whatever scraps they've thrown our way. The word oligarchy landed like a bomb in the room, its political implications adding a new dimension to what had already become a deeply personal conflict. Buddy's decision to frame the dispute in terms of power structures and systematic exclusion elevated the stakes beyond simple artistic disagreements into the realm of social justice and community governance. Tom seized on Buddy's analysis with obvious relief, finally finding an ally who understood the broader implications of the evening's conflict. Exactly. That's exactly what I've been trying to say all along. This isn't about respecting tradition. It's about maintaining an unjust system that benefits a few people at the expense of everyone else. But Marcus Webb had heard enough. The 61-year-old fiddle player stood up slowly, his instrument clutched in his weathered hands like a sacred relic. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his years and his deep connection to the musical traditions he had spent his life preserving. Unjust? You want to talk about unjust? Unjust is watching young people with no respect for their heritage try to destroy something beautiful because it doesn't immediately cater to their personal desires. Unjust is listening to people who've benefited from this community's support and encouragement turn around and attack the very foundations that made their participation possible. The room fell silent as Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate with each word. I learned to play fiddle from my grandfather, who learned from his grandfather before him. These songs we play, they're not just entertainment, they're prayers, they're history lessons, they're love letters to a way of life that's disappearing a little more every day. And you want to throw all that away because it doesn't fit your modern sensibilities, because it doesn't advance your personal agenda fast enough to suit your impatience. Tom's response was immediate and cutting. Your grandfather's grandfather didn't play in Murphy's Tavern, Marcus. He didn't perform for audiences or worry about stage time or deal with any of the issues we're fighting about tonight. You're using tradition as a weapon to defend a system that's really about your own ego and your own need to feel important. The accusation that Marcus was motivated by ego rather than genuine concern for cultural preservation struck at the heart of his self-image as a guardian of Red Hollow's musical heritage. His response came loaded with decades of accumulated passion and commitment. My ego? My ego? Son, I've given my entire adult life to keeping this music alive. I've taught it to children. I've performed it at weddings and funerals. I've carried it into every corner of this community where people needed to remember who they are and where they came from. And you think that's about ego? I think it's about control, Tom shot back, his voice rising to match Marcus's intensity. I think you've convinced yourself that you're the only one qualified to interpret and preserve these traditions, and anyone who disagrees with your approach is automatically wrong. I think you're so attached to being the authority figure that you can't imagine sharing that role with anyone else. The psychological warfare that was now taking place in Murphy's Tavern had moved far beyond musical disagreements into the realm of personal destruction. Each musician was using their intimate knowledge of the other's personalities, insecurities, and motivations to inflict maximum emotional damage. The bonds of friendship and mutual respect that had held the group together for years were being systematically severed with surgical precision. Sarah Jenkins watched from behind the bar with growing horror as the situation continued to deteriorate beyond anything she had ever witnessed in her years at Murphy's. The regular patrons who had come for a relaxing evening of music and beer were either leaving or sitting in stunned silence, unwilling participants in the destruction of Red Hollow's most cherished cultural institution. As the clock approached 10 o'clock, the hour when the evening's music program should have been reaching its peak, the only sounds filling Murphy's Tavern were the increasingly vicious exchanges between musicians who had forgotten everything except their desire to wound each other as deeply as possible. The instruments sat silent and abandoned, while their owners engaged in a war of words that would echo through Red Hollow long after the last insult had been hurled. Outside, the November wind continued to howl through the mountains, carrying with it the promise of winter and the end of things that had once seemed permanent. Inside Murphy's Tavern, the warmth and fellowship that had characterized Friday nights for over 20 years was dying a slow, agonizing death as pride, ambition, and accumulated resentments finally consumed everything in their path. The clock on Murphy's wall struck 10:30, and the weight of what had transpired began to settle over the room like mountain fog rolling through a valley after a storm. The venomous exchanges had finally exhausted themselves, leaving behind a silence that felt more oppressive than any of the shouting that had preceded it. 12 musicians sat or stood in various positions around the tavern, no longer looking at each other, each lost in their own thoughts about what had just been destroyed and what could never be repaired. Tom Bradley remained standing near the center of the room, but his earlier defiance had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like dawning comprehension of what he had done. The adrenaline that had fueled his attacks on the established order was beginning to wear off, and in its place came the cold realization that he had not just challenged the musical hierarchy of Red Hollow, he had systematically demolished every relationship he had built within the community over the past 2 years. His guitar case sat forgotten beside an overturned chair, a silent testament to the musical ambitions that had driven him to this moment of complete social destruction. Marcus Webb cradled his fiddle like a wounded child, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he contemplated what felt like the end of everything he had worked to preserve. At 61, he had lived through enough loss to recognize it when he saw it, and what had died in Murphy's Tavern tonight was more than just a music program. It was the sense of shared purpose and mutual respect that had defined Red Hollow's cultural identity for generations. The young man who had challenged his authority so aggressively was no longer an adversary to be defeated, but a symbol of larger forces that were beyond anyone's ability to control or contain. Eleanor Briggs sat at the old upright piano, her 73-year-old frame seeming smaller and more fragile than it had just hours earlier. Tom's cruel reference to her arthritic fingers had struck deeper than any physical blow could have, not because it was untrue, but because it forced her to confront the reality of her own mortality and the inevitable end of her long musical career. She had dedicated most of her adult life to fostering Red Hollow's music scene, nurturing young talents and preserving traditional songs, only to watch it all collapse in a single evening of misdirected anger and wounded pride. Pete Hutchins stared at his steel guitar with vacant eyes, his mind struggling to process the revelation that the community he had considered his second family was capable of such casual cruelty. His 45 years had been hard ones, marked by disappointments and setbacks that had taught him to value the few sources of joy and recognition in his life. Murphy's Friday nights had represented sanctuary, a place where his musical abilities earned him respect and admiration from people who saw him as more than just another coal miner counting down the days to retirement or disability. Now that sanctuary had been violated in ways that could never be undone, Murphy O'Brien moved through his tavern like a man surveying the wreckage of a natural disaster, picking up overturned chairs and empty beer bottles while trying to avoid eye contact with any of his musical performers. At 68, he had seen his share of conflicts and disagreements, but nothing had prepared him for witnessing the complete destruction of the cultural program that had defined his establishment for over 2 decades. The accusations about his secret dealings with Tom Bradley hung in the air like an unpleasant odor, tainting every interaction and casting doubt on his integrity as a neutral facilitator of Red Hollow's music scene. The regular patrons who had come to Murphy's expecting an evening of familiar songs and community fellowship had long since departed, leaving behind only the hardcore observers who remained out of morbid curiosity or genuine concern for the musicians they had come to know over the years. Their presence served as a constant reminder that what had transpired would not remain secret, that the story of this evening would spread throughout Red Hollow like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and shocked retellings that would grow more dramatic with each repetition. Sarah Jenkins continued her nervous cleaning behind the bar, her movements automatic and mechanical as she tried to process what she had witnessed. In her years at Murphy's, she had seen musicians disagree about song choices, argue about volume levels, even engage in heated discussions about the proper way to play traditional pieces. But she had never seen anything approaching the systematic character assassination that had taken place tonight. The deliberate targeting of personal vulnerabilities and the complete abandonment of the mutual respect that had made Red Hollow's music scene special. Billy Palmer, whose 19-year-old idealism had been shattered by exposure to the darker aspects of adult relationships, sat hunched over his harmonica with the defeated posture of someone who had lost something precious before fully understanding what it was. His questions about whether this was what adulthood looked like had been answered in the most devastating way possible, and his dreams of joining Red Hollow's musical community had been replaced by disillusionment and a growing desire to escape to some place where people treated each other with basic human decency. The Garrett twins, Jimmy and Johnny, huddled together near the door with their mandolins, whispering urgently about logistics and timing as they planned their exit from a scene that no longer held any appeal for them. Their harmonies had been one of the main attractions at Murphy's Friday nights, and their departure would leave a musical void that could never be adequately filled. But more importantly, their decision to leave represented the beginning of an exodus that would ultimately drain Red Hollow of much of its remaining cultural vitality. Bobby Price sat with his electric guitar unplugged, staring at the amplifier that had been the source of so much controversy over the years. His attempts to modernize Red Hollow's sound had always met with resistance from the traditional players, but he had persevered in the hope that gradual change might be possible. Tonight's events had convinced him that such hopes were naive, that the community was too deeply divided to ever achieve the kind of musical synthesis he had envisioned. The dream of bridging the gap between old and new, traditional and contemporary, had died along with everything else in the toxic atmosphere of Murphy's Tavern. Cecil Crawford methodically packed his banjo into its case, his movements deliberate and final. The mild-mannered musician had never sought conflict or controversy, preferring to support other players and contribute to the overall sound rather than seeking individual recognition. But Tom's accusation that he had been passively undermining other musicians' performances had wounded him deeply, not because it was accurate, but because it suggested that his decades of loyal participation had been viewed with suspicion and resentment rather than appreciation. Danny Morrison's bass guitar leaned against the wall like a forgotten monument to better times, its strings reflecting the overhead lights in a way that seemed almost melancholy. His complaints about the marginalization of non-traditional instruments had been voiced in hopes of creating more inclusive policies, but the evening's events had demonstrated that inclusivity was impossible in a community so fragmented by competing visions and personal animosities. The bass lines that had provided foundation for countless Friday night performances would no longer anchor Red Hollow's music, leaving behind only the memory of what might have been. Patty Sullivan stared at her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she was afraid to ask. Her reputation as a diplomatic peacemaker had been shattered by her decision to join the attack on Tom Bradley, and she was beginning to understand that her participation in the evening's hostilities had compromised her ability to serve as a mediator in future conflicts. The soprano voice that had graced Red Hollow weddings and funerals for years would be forever associated with this night of destruction, tainted by her willingness to abandon her principles in favor of joining the mob. Clarence "Buddy" Mason sat behind his drum kit like a general surveying a lost battlefield, his political analysis of the music scene's power structures having contributed to the escalation of conflict rather than providing a path toward resolution. His drum beats had provided rhythm for countless Friday night sessions, but they had also marked time during the most destructive evening in Red Hollow's recent memory. The irony was not lost on him that his attempts to democratize the music scene had instead contributed to its complete collapse. As the minutes ticked by in suffocating silence, each musician began to contemplate the practical implications of what had occurred. The informal agreements about performance scheduling, song selection and equipment sharing that had governed Red Hollow's music scene for decades had been rendered meaningless by the evening's revelations about secret negotiations and preferential treatment. The trust that had made collaboration possible had been systematically destroyed, leaving behind only suspicion and resentment that would poison any future attempts at reconciliation. The economic impact of the music program's collapse would be felt most immediately by Murphy O'Brien, whose Friday night revenues had depended heavily on the crowds that came to hear live performances. Without the weekly gathering that had drawn people from across the region, Murphy's Tavern would struggle to maintain the community role that had defined its identity for over 4 decades. The ripple effects would extend throughout Red Hollow's small business community, as the cultural tourism that had brought outside visitors to town would likely evaporate along with the music scene that had been its primary attraction. More devastating than the economic consequences, however, was the cultural damage that had been inflicted on Red Hollow's sense of identity and community cohesion. For generations, the town had prided itself on its musical heritage and its ability to preserve traditional Appalachian culture while adapting to changing times. The music scene at Murphy's had served as both symbol and substance of that heritage, providing a space where different generations could come together to celebrate their shared traditions while exploring new possibilities for artistic expression. Tonight's events had revealed the fragility of those traditions and the ease with which community bonds could be severed by individual ambitions and personal grievances. The younger musicians who had looked to their elders for guidance and inspiration had instead witnessed a masterclass in how to destroy relationships and abandon principles in pursuit of narrow self-interest. The older musicians who had seen themselves as guardians of cultural heritage had been exposed as flawed human beings whose commitment to tradition was sometimes indistinguishable from resistance to change and fear of irrelevance. The implications extended beyond music into every aspect of Red Hollow's social fabric. If the town's most respected cultural institution could collapse so completely and so quickly, what did that say about the stability of other community organizations and traditions? How could residents trust their neighbors and leaders when the people they had admired most were capable of such petty cruelty and vindictive behavior? The questions raised by the evening's events would haunt Red Hollow long after the immediate shock had worn off. As 11 o'clock approached, the musicians began to gather their instruments and prepare to leave Murphy's Tavern for what many suspected would be the last time. There were no formal announcements or official declarations, but everyone understood that something irreplaceable had been lost and that attempts to recreate it would be futile. The magic that had made Friday night special could not be manufactured or imposed from above. It had emerged organically from genuine affection and mutual respect that no longer existed. Tom Bradley was the first to move toward the door, his guitar case heavy in his hands as he contemplated the isolation that awaited him, in a community where he had systematically alienated everyone who might have been an ally or friend. His victory in challenging the established order felt hollow and meaningless now that he understood the full cost of his rebellion. The recognition and respect he had sought so desperately had been replaced by notoriety and ostracism that would follow him for years to come. Marcus Webb followed shortly after, his fiddle case clasped protectively against his chest like armor that had failed to protect him when he needed it most. The traditional songs he had worked so hard to preserve would survive in recordings and written notation, but the living tradition that connected them to their cultural roots had been mortally wounded. Future generations might learn the melodies and lyrics, but they would never fully understand the context and meaning that had given those songs their power and significance. One by one, the other musicians filed out of Murphy's Tavern into the cold November night, their instruments silent and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they had participated in something that could never be undone. The parking lot that had once buzzed with post-performance conversations and plans for future collaborations was now filled only with the sounds of car doors slamming and engines starting as former friends departed without saying goodbye. Eleanor Briggs was among the last to leave, her arthritic fingers struggling with the clasps on her music bag as she gathered sheet music that might never be performed again. The piano bench where she had sat for countless Friday nights remained empty behind her, a monument to better times that now seemed as distant as her youth. Her final glance around Murphy's Tavern took in the overturned chairs, empty beer bottles, and general atmosphere of desolation that had replaced the warmth and fellowship she had helped to create over decades of dedicated participation. Murphy O'Brien locked the door behind the last departing musician and stood alone in his empty tavern, surrounded by the physical remnants of the evening's destruction. The stage area that had once hosted joyful performances now looked like a crime scene, its equipment scattered and abandoned by people who had fled as if from a plague. The silence that filled the room was not the peaceful quiet of a successful evening's end, but the oppressive stillness of death and abandonment. Outside in the darkness of Red Hollow's mountain landscape, the November wind continued its relentless howling, carrying with it the echoes of angry words and broken relationships that would reverberate through the community for generations to come. The 12 musicians who had gathered with such different expectations just hours earlier were now scattered to their separate homes, each carrying their own burden of guilt, regret, and wounded pride into a future that would never again include the simple pleasure of making music together on Friday nights at Murphy's Tavern. The town itself seemed to sense the magnitude of what had been lost, its dark streets and shuttered windows reflecting the cultural void that had been created in a single evening of misdirected passion and destructive ambition. Red Hollow would survive, as small communities always do, but it would be forever changed by the night when its musical soul died in a storm of harsh words and harder feelings that proved impossible to take back or forgive. In the days and weeks that followed, various attempts would be made to resurrect the Friday night music program or create alternative venues for community gathering. But these efforts would be hampered by the personal animosities and trust deficits that had been created during those fateful hours at Murphy's Tavern. Some musicians would leave Red Hollow altogether, seeking fresh starts in communities where their reputations hadn't been tainted by association with the evening's events. Others would retreat into private practice and informal gatherings, unwilling to risk further public exposure of their vulnerabilities and limitations. The story of what happened at Murphy's Tavern on November 15, 1980, would become part of Red Hollow's oral history, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment as new residents arrived and old-timers tried to explain why the town no longer had the vibrant music scene that had once been its pride and joy. Children who grew up in Red Hollow after that night would hear fragments of the story and wonder what it might have been like to live in a community where people gathered regularly to celebrate their shared heritage through song and performance. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the evening's events was not what was destroyed but what was never created, the songs that were never written, the performances that were never given, the collaborations that were never attempted, and the cultural innovations that were never explored, because the community had lost the trust and cooperation necessary to support such creative endeavors. The silence that settled over Red Hollow after November 15, 1980, was not just the absence of music, but the absence of possibility itself, the death of dreams and aspirations that could have enriched the lives of countless individuals and strengthened the bonds that hold communities together through times of challenge and change. As the story of that night passed into legend, it would serve as a cautionary tale about the fragility of human relationships and the ease with which pride and ambition can destroy even the most cherished traditions. The 12 musicians who had gathered at Murphy's Tavern with such different expectations had learned too late that some words can never be taken back and some wounds can never fully heal, leaving behind only the silence that follows when music dies and communities lose their voice.